War in the Middle Ages was brutal, and when the battle ended, the field was left covered with the dead. But soldiers couldn't just walk away. They had to deal with the aftermath, burying comrades, handling enemies, and preventing disease. What they did next showed not only how they fought, but also how they lived with death in a world where war never truly ended. Number 1. The aftermath of medieval battlefields. When the fighting stopped, soldiers faced a field that looked like a market smashed by a storm. Bodies, broken weapons, dead horses, and dropped gear covered the ground. The very first move was practical. Men gathered usable equipment because metal and good leather were money and survival. Armor, swords, buckles, and boots were reclaimed or looted, and this happened fast while adrenaline was still high. Clearing gear also opened paths for carts and stretchers to reach the wounded who still had a chance. The work was rough and direct, and no one pretended it was noble. It was how an army caught its breath after shock and noise. Commanders worried about what came next. Rot, smell, and flies signaled risk even if people did not know about microbes. They believed foul air could sicken a camp, so leaving bodies out was a problem for health and morale. Orders went out to sort the field. The wounded were moved toward makeshift care areas. The dead were pulled into lines and checked for anything that identified rank or household. A signet ring, a painted surcoat, or a unique helmet crest could mark a knight for recovery by his family or lord. Ordinary soldiers rarely had that kind of marker, so they were recorded quickly if possible and set aside for trenches. Mass graves were the normal solution when the numbers were high. Crews dug long cuts in the earth and laid bodies shoulder to shoulder, sometimes in layers, to keep animals away and to make the ground usable again. Archaeology at Towton shows how this looked in reality, with tight burials and heavy weapon injuries that tell the story better than any chronicle. These graves could be opened years later to move remains into consecrated ground, which matched religious expectations once time and money allowed. Some battlefields never yielded obvious pits, but that does not mean people were careless. Agincourt is a good example. Bodies were carried away and buried at a distance, so the ground looked clean once the army moved on. In other places, locals finished the job after soldiers left. They hauled remains with ropes, covered them quickly, and tried to protect wells and grazing. Quicklime might be spread to speed decay and reduce smell, a choice rooted in fear of bad air and practical need to get fields back into use. High-status bodies could follow a different path. When nobles died far from home, families sometimes used a method that separated flesh from bone, so the clean skeleton could travel safely for burial. It sounds grim to modern ears, but it solved real problems of distance, heat, and decay, and it honored the expectation of resting among ancestors. Not every site was buried at once. At Visby, excavations revealed fighters still in armor, which shows how fast burials could happen when time and danger pressed hard. At other times, the ground itself kept the memory. Years later, plows still turned up buckles, arrowheads, and bone. Even after the banners were long gone, the soil held quiet proof of what soldiers had to do when the noise ended. Number 2. How they dealt with their own dead. After the fight, the first duty toward fallen comrades was simple care and order. Men checked who was still breathing, pulled friends from piles of shields, and carried them to the rear. Only when the wounded were moved did they turn to the bodies. The goal was to treat their own with respect, keep the camp safe, and move the army without delay. Identification came first because rank and family mattered. Squires and close companions looked for a familiar surcoat, a heraldic badge, a signet ring, or a carved belt fitting. They noted scars, hair, and height when armor hid the face. If a knight's name was known, messengers could ride to his household so the family could claim him. For high-status men, retrieval was a duty, not a favor. Units formed search parties, gathered their dead into small groups, and kept lists where they could. Chaplains moved among them and spoke brief prayers because long rites were impossible on an open field. The next step was deciding where the bodies would go. If the army could linger, they dug trenches close by and made mass graves for common soldiers. The bodies were laid shoulder to shoulder, sometimes in layers with brush or straw between them, then covered to keep animals away. When commanders feared bad air and spoiled water, they used quick burials to quiet the field and protect wells. If a route home was safe and the family could pay, a nobleman's remains were prepared for transport. That could mean washing the body, wrapping it in cloth, and loading it onto a cart with guards. When distance and heat made this risky, men sometimes separated parts for different resting places. It was common to bury entrails near the battlefield or at a nearby church, then send the heart or bones home for a final grave among ancestors. The purpose was clear. The family wanted a known tomb and a priest to say regular prayers for the soul. Wills often set aside money for candles, funeral bread, and masses, so comrades tried to honor those wishes even in rough conditions. Ordinary soldiers did not receive the same attention, yet their units still tried to keep dignity. Friends gathered small keepsakes to return to relatives if they ever met them again. Helmets and mail shirts were reclaimed for the living, but a token like a knife sheath might travel home. Villagers and camp workers helped with digging and hauling when the army had to march. They covered pits, set simple markers, and kept animals out. By the time banners moved on, the ground looked quiet, yet every man who took part remembered who was laid there and why the work was done quickly and carefully. Number 3. The fate of the enemy dead. Victors handled enemy bodies with a mix of practicality, fear, and message-making. Once the looting ended, commanders looked at time, weather, and risk of sickness, then chose what could be done fast. If the field was safe and the army needed to move, the fallen enemy might be left where they lay for a day or two, while teams cleared paths and gathered usable gear. That pause was not only about speed, it also broadcast power. A field covered with enemy dead warned nearby towns and rival lords about who now controlled the region. Yet leaving bodies out for long was risky. People believed foul air spread illness, and animals would come at night. So the next step was usually burial on the spot, but without ceremony. Mass graves took care of most of the enemy. Diggers cut long trenches and laid bodies shoulder to shoulder. Layers of brush or straw might go in to keep the soil from sinking too fast. A thin cover of earth followed when time was tight. Deeper pits were made if the army planned to camp nearby. Quicklime might be scattered for smell control and to keep scavengers away. These pits rarely had markers, which erased names and units and turned the enemy into a single memory of defeat. When rain washed the topsoil months later, bones sometimes surfaced. Local villagers gathered them again and closed the ground so fields could return to use. Status could change the script. The body of a noble opponent had value, even in death. Returning a highborn enemy to his family could earn a payment or secure goodwill during future negotiations. Messengers carried word to the household, and the corpse might be moved to a church or fortified manor. If distance and heat made travel risky, men sometimes buried the entrails nearby and sent the rest later. Hearts or bones could be set aside for transport, because families wanted their dead in ancestral ground, where prayers and masses would continue. Religious and political tensions shaped choices as well. During holy wars and frontier campaigns, the enemy might be denied burial as a final insult. Heads could be displayed on gates to project order after a siege. In other cases, clergy pushed for at least a thin layer of earth over all the fallen, arguing that leaving bodies exposed brought God's anger along with disease. Cities under siege faced their own problems. When space ran out and the smell grew harsh, defenders dumped corpses in moats or burial pits outside the walls. Attackers sometimes used bodies as psychological weapons by pushing them toward the gates or hurling them with engines to sap morale. Away from famous battles, most work fell to locales. Once armies marched off, villagers finished the burials, fenced wells, and cleaned irrigation ditches. In every case, the treatment of enemy dead balanced fear, speed, and the need to send a clear message about who had won and how that victory would be remembered. Number 4. Burning, boiling, and bone collecting. Burning was the bluntest solution when bodies piled up and the heat or stench became dangerous. Armies chose it when graves were hard to dig or when commanders feared disease would sweep the camp. Pyres needed huge amounts of wood, so full cremation was not routine. More often, it was a mixed cleanup where carts brought the worst decayed corpses, animal carcasses, and battlefield debris to a single fire. The aim was to control smell, keep animals away, and make the ground usable again. Priests might say a short prayer, but speed drove the work. Wind and terrain mattered too. If a valley trapped smoke, soldiers moved the burn to higher ground to keep the camp livable. Quicklime sometimes went on the ashes or on shallow burials nearby to shorten decay and reduce odor. Boiling sounds shocking today, yet it had a clear purpose in the age of long campaigns. When a high-status fighter died far from home, his companions wanted his remains to reach a family church. Distance, heat, and time made that risky. The solution in some regions was to separate parts of the body so transport was safer. Flesh could be removed by boiling in water or wine and the clean bones sent home. Entrails might be buried close to the field or at a nearby church, while the heart could travel in a small container for a second burial. This practice served faith, family memory, and property rights because a known tomb anchored prayers and inheritance. It did not happen to common soldiers, but the idea shaped how units planned for noble casualties and why scribes recorded identity marks so carefully. Bone collecting was the long aftercare that followed once the crisis passed. Rain lifted soil and exposed skeletons. Farmers and villagers gathered what surfaced and moved it to pits, charnel houses, or small ossuaries beside churches. Skulls and long bones were stacked with rough order so fields could return to work. On some famous sites, a chapel rose over the burial ground, and that turned a place of fear into a fixed point for memory. Soldiers who revisited old fields knew these routines well. They had watched pyres built at dusk, helped prepare a lord's remains for the road, and later seen bones lifted from the plough line. All three methods were answers to the same hard problem. Armies needed to protect the living, honor the dead when they could, and keep moving. Number 5. The work of gravediggers and common folk. When an army marched away, the hardest labor often began for the people who never chose the fight. Lords ordered local communities to clean the field, and parish priests urged the same because open corpses threatened water, livestock, and morale. Villagers, town laborers, camp followers, and hired gravediggers formed work parties with carts, spades, mattocks, ropes, and iron hooks. They moved in a slow line and worked from the edges inward so they did not trample the evidence of where trenches should go. The first task was to make the ground safe. Wells were covered. Streams were checked for bodies and gear. Fires burned spoiled food, blood-soaked bedding, and splintered shields. Anything that could rot fast or taint a pasture was cleared before the digging even started. The second task was sorting. If a fallen knight or officer was recognized, his body was set aside for recovery by household men, or for a short removal to the nearest church. Most others were handled as a single burden. Work crews dug long pits in the driest reachable soil and kept them narrow so the sides would not collapse. Bodies were dragged by rope or carried on doors and hurdles. They were laid shoulder to shoulder, often with branches or straw between layers to keep the fill from sinking too quickly. A thin scatter of lime might be added when the smell grew harsh and wood was scarce for burning. Priests or friars walked the lines with brief prayers, more for the living than the dead, because time pressed and wolves or dogs would come at night if the field stayed open. Payment for this work was practical. Some communities received small wages, bread and ale, or a short relief from rents and tolls. Carters and smiths earned extra by repairing wheels and tools bent by the weight. Women and older men often did the quiet tasks that mattered later. They washed the stretchers, patched clothes, and gathered small keepsakes to hold in a parish chest in case a relative came looking. Once the pits were closed, the job was not finished. Rain lifted soil and exposed bones in the months that followed, so villagers went back after ploughing and moved remains to a charnel corner, or to an ossuary by the church. Simple wooden crosses, or a low mound marked the worst places so herds would avoid them. In some regions, a small wayside chapel rose on the ridge where the dead were thickest, and annual prayers turned a place of fear into a fixed point of memory. Gravediggers learned to read a battlefield like a map, They knew where horses fell by the soil churn, where arrows lay by the hedgerow, and where a trench would hold without flooding. They worked quickly because heat and flies did not wait, yet they tried to keep a plain dignity. The goal was always the same: protect the living, return what few known men could be reclaimed, and fold the rest back into the earth so fields, roads, and markets could breathe again. Number 6. The spiritual and psychological weight of it all. After a battle, men did not just wipe blades and walk away. They carried images of the field in their heads, and those pictures followed them through camp and home. Chaplains tried to steady nerves with short prayers among the wounded and the dead. A whispered creed, a blessing, or a psalm gave shape to grief when there was no time for long rites. Many soldiers believed the soul needed help after death, so they promised candles, alms, or a set number of masses once they reached a church. Some kept small relics in a pouch and touched them while working through the bodies. That habit did not erase fear, but it offered a path to feel useful and clean after hard tasks. Commanders knew morale was fragile. They allowed quick moments of confession and small signs of respect even when the burial was rough. Men raised a cross from spear shafts or marked a mound with a shield boss so they could say they had not left comrades nameless. The belief in purgatory shaped choices in camp accounts and wills. A knight might set aside money for prayers at a local altar or for a small anniversary service so his name would be spoken again each year. It mattered because remembrance was seen as action, not just talk. Night was the hardest time. Veterans described broken sleep, sudden starts, and dreams of the dead asking to be moved from open ground. Some returned to old fields months later to rebury bones or fix a marker that had fallen. Others made a short pilgrimage to a shrine to keep a vow they had spoken in fear. The pressure did not always show as silence. There was also dark humor, strong drink, and loud storytelling by the fire. Those habits helped a group find balance when the day had been ugly. Yet the weight remained. The work with the dead forced men to think about judgment, mercy, and luck. It taught them that victory brought duty, and that duty did not end when the horn stopped.